Mm.
Hello.
All right. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Awesome. Awesome. What is, oh, that's on my screen. I was like, did I end up with a black dot on my face? Uh, all right. So, eh, don't tell anyone, but my secret hack for not constantly looking at the person on the screen and instead looking at the camera is to actually put a piece of paper in front of my screen so that I'm not constantly looking down going, yeah, okay.
Makes sense. When I was when I used to do job interviews over Skype, I would put little post-its with my talking points on either side of the camera.
Nice,
To make sure,
nice.
yeah.
Yeah, I put my questions up here on the paper that I then put in front of the camera, so I'm not doing this the whole interview.
Excellent.
Well, you look amazing. How is the pandemic treating you?
All things considered, we are fairly lucky in our household. We
Mhm.
both have jobs where we can work out of the house. It's been a little challenging business-wise, having to work out, how to deal with the pandemic vis-a-vis fundraising for 2 clients, which I'll probably just put their contract in abeyance for a few months until things start getting back to normal for them. But all told, it's much different and much preferable to a job where we're either completely laid off, or I risk bringing something back into an immune compromised household, which we are.
Yeah. So let's start with the basic introductions before I get swept away in talking with you, as we are wont to do. Okay. I'm River, to anyone that doesn't know. And why don't you introduce yourself for everyone that's watching?
My name is Michael Selvaggio. I am a political consultant and lobbyist working in the state of Oregon. Been doing this for about 18 years now, and done a number of things and a number of roles, and I will bring those up as context warrants as we have this discussion.
Awesome. Well, I have definitely been looking forward to this. As we've gone around, we're like, we're going to do this maybe now, but not during election. And then this is going on, and it's just been crazy. So I'm glad I was finally able to ping you down, and I apologize sincerely for the late start. The setup I had used before, I was actually modifying, and then if you modify a setup, you are just ensuring that something will absolutely go wrong.
It's always the way.
Yes, exactly. So give me a little bit of a description of, so you're helping with campaigns. What kind of activities do you do to help with campaigns, and what kind of, I know you've worked as a lobbyist for various groups. I'm not sure what your confidentiality requirements are on anything, but if you can kind of explain a bit about that, because lobbyist is kind of a bad word these days.
Right.
Like, oh, they're a lobbyist. And yeah, like to give your own spin on that.
Well, there's a lot of words and phrases that describe what I do. Advocate, government relations consultant. Lobbyist is actually the word that's in Oregon statutes. So if you go to Oregon statutes, chapter 171, where it talks about lobbyist registration, that's the word that's used. We're not called advocates. We're not called government relations professionals. Um, and so that's the word that I'll be using, not because it has a particular connotation, but just because that's what's recognized and agreed upon. And you're right, though, it does have a little bit of a negative connotation to it. But I think what's surprising to a lot of people is that there's no one in the state that's not represented by at least one or two lobbyists. Um, and so, whatever you're into, wherever you live, whatever your job is, you probably have a lobbyist or several looking out after you in Salem. We've all heard of lobbyists for big tobacco and big oil, um,
Right.
or the NRA, and certainly they're there, but there's also lobbyists like lobbyists for the Audubon Society, lobbyists for Washington County, lobbyists for workers in a particular field, and it's you know a lobbyist is like so many other tools. It can be used for good or used for evil, and it really depends entirely on the context. When I was uh, a staffer in the state senate in 2003, we were working on a piece of legislation that would have reformed how insurance companies are able to set premium rates, because at the time they were setting them in part by a person's credit score, which we did not agree with.
Yeah.
And so of course you had um, the the organizations that were left of center helping out on that. And to our surprise, it was a coalition that also included the lobbyist for the Oregon Christian Coalition. And not a lot would these different groups agree on, but they were able to come together on that issue because they did have some overlap. So it's not always a binary thing where you're either, going to agree with that lobbyist or not agree with that lobbyist. Um, Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's just a matter of uh, how you happen to interact with them.
Right, right. And we often see labor unions in particular held up as progressive advocates for rights and stuff. But I know that you've actually done lobbying work on behalf of unions. And so
Yeah.
when people form these unions, as we're looking for calls to do, well, in a lot of places, but Amazon in particular, um, would you say that forming a union um, kind of opens a door to, I guess, getting access to a lobbyist, or creating a way that you can have that, dedicated advocate for the union's interests? Whereas if you're individual employees, you then are looking at more like, charity causes or particular nonprofits being your representation instead of, a labor union
Mhm.
representation. If that question was not too circulous and all over the place.
Um, I do lobby for labor unions, and I'm going to say that forming a labor union um, is a door opening to a lot of great results from pooling resources and solidarity with one another. Not just being able to have a lobbyist, but uh, I also want to be clear that if, for whatever reason, you're in a situation where you're not able to form a union, like let's say you're in a particular uh, mode of work where the labor relations board doesn't kind of recognize you as a workplace. Like let's say you're a part-time freelance contractor for something.
Right, right,
Um, and you have an issue with a bunch of other people in that field that you want to bring to bear to the state legislature or to your county commission. Uh, you don't have to form a union in order to say we're going to get together, pool our resources, and um, and use that to direct our action and to advocate for our interests. And so if you're in a position where you can form a union, I think that's great. And if you're not, that does not shut you out of those kinds of opportunities.
Nice. Um, there are some things you worked on. We talked previously about how access here in Oregon is actually amazingly accessible to the sort of halls of power as they were towards legislatures. There isn't actually a big wall.
Yeah.
What would you say to people? How would you let people know, or can you let people know what you've seen as to how people can get access to the halls of power, things that feel distant and abstract? What can they do to actually get their voices heard, and not only heard, but then afterwards hold to account? What things can they do while still being boots on the ground, busy, underpaid, overworked people? What options do they
Absolutely. First of all, we are so lucky to live in Oregon, which does have, as you said, a very open state government. And not only is it easy to access, it's also been made easy to track. So if anyone has an interest in a particular bill or a particular issue, they can go onto the Oregon Legislative website at oregonlegislature.gov, and there is a link to what's called the Oregon Legislative Information System. So if you just go to oregonlegislature.gov, that'll give you information about the legislature and what it is and who the senators are, et cetera. But if you dig into that Oregon Legislative Information System, or OLIS for short, then you get a very advanced way that anyone can just go and look at what bills are being introduced. You can search them by keywords, by numbers, et cetera. You can see who the sponsors are and dig into that. You can submit testimony. You can look up testimony, and you can also track the progress. So you can say, this bill interests me, and so I'm going to click here, and I'm going to say, send me an email or a text when this bill gets scheduled for hearing. And then we've all seen, videos or movies or TV shows of people going down in front of a legislative panel to testify. But in Oregon, it's very, very easy to do that remotely, or even to submit written testimony through that portal. And so when legislators are getting ready to vote on something, they're not merely going to be sitting behind that dais and hearing the lobbyists speak. They're also going to be going to that same exact site, looking through the materials and saying, all right, let's see who sent something on this. And although it doesn't sound when people imagine, like, these big powerful special interest lobbyists versus, like, them writing a letter, I know it's very easy to cynically say that doesn't matter, but I can tell you that in Oregon and in Salem, it does matter, because when you look at that list, it's a great equalizer. There's no distinction between River sent this from Washington County versus
have?
lobbyist McLobbyface sent this from Big Oil back in DC. It's a letter, and you get to make your case, and you don't. I don't think you see that kind of granular participation in DC that way. And again, as you mentioned, the elected officials themselves are very, very open. We don't have a professional legislature in Oregon. We have a volunteer legislature. They do make a certain amount of money, but it's a system where people are expected to hold their other jobs, and I think that keeps them much more ingrained in the rest of the community. There's pluses and minuses for that, but one of the pluses is that they're not spending all their time in an office in Salem. Most of the time throughout the year, and in fact a good amount of the time through the session, they're actually in your community. And so if you email one and say, I would like to meet with Representative so-and-so because I heard about this issue and I want to hear what they think about it, or I have an idea about that, you're more likely than not to get scheduled for office hours, which, again, since it's a volunteer legislature, are probably going to be at a local coffee shop.
Right. Right. Yeah, I've had I can attest to that because I've had success meeting with Elizabeth Steiner Hayward and Tina Kotek, and I think it's Senator Fredericks. He's in
Yep,
the Cascadia area. Okay. Yeah, he's amazing.
he is.
I absolutely. I'm gonna have to ask him to come on because he's absolutely wonderful and brilliant.
He he
Um,
he is one of my favorites. We don't always agree. we
mhm,
we some I love working with him. Sometimes we have to work against each other, but it's always a it's always an open and mutually respectful process. Um, and that's one of the great things about Oregon is you don't see um, the partisan rancor that you do in DC.
very nice. Do you think that's changing?
A little bit, yes. The Over the last couple of sessions, we obviously saw a significant split, um, both ideologically and eventually geographically between the Democrats and the Republicans in Salem. And I think that a part of this is due to this happening more and more on a national level. I think that part of it is due also to changing culture in Salem, which may also be linked to that. When I started working in the legislature in '03, uh, like I said, legislators have other jobs. And at the time, uh, the idea was that you bring your expertise into the building with you. So you would have, and there was, and everyone's going to say, oh, they're probably all lawyers. There were almost no lawyers in the Senate, except for one or two. I think there
Hmm.
were a few more in the House, which is 60 members. But most of them were either farmers or an accountant or an insurance salesman or
Hmm.
a shoemaker, um,
School teacher.
school teachers. Um, and when an issue would come up, like I was talking about the insurance bill previously, a lot of legislators, regardless of their party affiliation, would say, "Well, Senator Hannon's an insurance salesman. Let's ask him what he thinks about that, because he would know. He's the insurance
Right.
salesman." Um, and Nowadays, I don't think you would get that deference to someone regardless of their party label. We
Mm.
had Democratic senators that were asking Senator Hannon what he thought, even though he was a Republican, and he'd give them an honest answer because he's an honest guy. Um, the fact of the matter is that that's less likely nowadays because of, I think, two reasons. One is that the the legislators are more cognizant and rightly concerned about the risk of losing a primary election than a general election. And
Right.
so in a general election, you have to appeal broadly to to your constituency. In a primary election, you have to appeal specifically to your party, and that's a bit of a zig and zag, so to speak. But the more that legislative districts become uh, made almost tailor-made for one specific party, the more likely you are to have their actual race in the primary and then not really care about the general. For instance, if you're a legislator running um, in the heart of Portland, the real race is going to happen during the primary, and then the general election, I can guarantee you that the Democrat's going to win. Similarly, out in Eastern Oregon, um, you're going to have districts that are so overwhelmingly Republican that, again, the actual contest is going to be the primary, and then I guarantee the Republican's going to win. Um, and so the more that legislators become cognizant of that, the more that they'll feel that they have to run things by their party as opposed to their constituency. And it's I don't begrudge them that, because I think it's a rational reaction um, to how things have been set up. But it would be lovely to kind of take a few steps back to '03. It's worth noting that the same system was in place in '03, but I think that there was much more of a collegial culture in Salem at the time. And I think some people may uh, disagree with this assessment, but in 2007, the legislature passed some very, very stern ethics regulations that said that lobbyists couldn't buy drinks or dinners for legislators, and they couldn't buy drinks for staff, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
And that was in reaction to a few notable scandals in 2006 that were, I think, beyond the pale. But
Mm-hmm.
uh, but it was such a broad, sweeping thing that it functionally eliminated this what we call the Salem nightlife. What it used to be was the legislature would wrap up its business for the day. People would go out in downtown Salem and either have a reception, or they would go drinking together, and etc. And you could go to any one of these bars and see legislators from both parties sitting around talking with each other. The governor would even pop by now and again. And it wasn't so much they weren't talking politics for politics' sake. They were really just um, forging those relationships, recognizing that they were all part of the same cloth, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Nowadays, since none of that legally exists anymore, when they're done with business for the day, everyone just drives home. So I think that there was something lost there, but I don't think that's the only reason. I do think that there's this sense of national partisan divide just kind of seeping in.
Moving back a little bit to what you were talking about, anybody sending in letters in regards to bills, a common response that I have heard when I talk to people who have become apathetic about politics and what you can do is that, sure, I can submit a letter to whatever legislator, but since I'm not the ones filling their coffers, and I don't have the big bucks, they're not actually going to read it. They're going to vote with who gives them the donation money, and it doesn't matter what regular people send in. Particularly, I've heard people say that with letters or with emails, because they feel like it's easy to ignore that. Is that something that you've noticed in the Oregon legislature?
Yes and no.
Mm-hmm.
It is easy to ignore a letter. It's less easy to ignore 50 letters. If I was the only person who felt a certain way about something and I sent in one letter, it probably would get ignored. I'm sure it would be read, but it would probably be somewhat discounted. If me and 100 of my friends sent in a letter, you better believe that the staff and the legislature would say, we have to think very carefully about this. This could be a movement. This could be representative of a lot more people in the district. And with regard to who's filling coffers, I always tell candidates, having money is great, but that money is not going to be worth anything to you if you don't ultimately convert it into votes. So all the donations that candidates get, they don't just get for the sake of having donations. They get them because they need to convert that to a TV ad or a mail piece that shows up at your front door, or a canvas operation, or Facebook ads, or staff to run all of that. And so they're very cognizant of the fact that Um, if there's a cheaper way to do that, if there's a cheaper way to get those votes, that's great, because none of them like being on the phones asking for money. They hate it.
But yeah.
Um, but the and I want to also stress that these checks don't just appear out of thin air from some special interest. Um, People ask me, what's the difference between a special interest and a public interest? And I say, a public interest is the stuff that you support. A special interest is the stuff that the other guy supports. Um, so, a legislator gets a big check from an environmental organization. Uh, that's not representative of one person. That's representative of a large swath of Oregonians that pulled their resources together and said, we care about these issues and we want to be able to act in solidarity so that our voice is even louder. And that's how that check gets made. Likewise, in Eastern Oregon, you may have a more rural oriented group, and that's not necessarily an evil private interest either. That's people like either farmers or cattlemen or some other group coming together, pulling their resources for issues that they genuinely care about and genuinely are concerned about. That doesn't make that money dirty. That means that I disagree with it sometimes, but um, I don't begrudge people uh, from pooling their resources and trying to turn that into action. At the end of the day, that's what a union is. That's what a union does. We do have in Oregon some specific individuals that have done very well financially and do cut enormous checks just from their own pocketbook, and that's usually reported. We don't have campaign contribution limits in Oregon, but we do have some of the strictest reporting requirements. And so if someone, let's say, Shuey McSneaker decides to cut a $3 million check to a particular candidate of his choice, that's legal to do, but it's also going to get reported through the Secretary of State's website. And I don't know the exact link, but if you search for ORSTAR, that's ORESTAR, anyone can look up campaign contributions to state and local officials. And so that does provide a level of accountability, but it's the kind of accountability that people have to engage on their own.
Do we see a lot of, there's a legal entity, super PACs, they're there.
Yes.
Is that something that we see here in Oregon where, yeah, if, Chewy, I don't know, you said, I've lost the name. So if the guy decides to donate 3 million of his own money, yeah, he shows up. But if he decides to create a super PAC and they donate that money, then it's just this super PAC and nobody knows where it's coming from.
Sure, understood. The short answer is no, we don't see that in Oregon. Super PACs are a federal entity, so to the degree that we do see super PAC activity in Oregon, it will be for federal races. And of course, we do have federal officials in Oregon, and let me take a step back, because from my perspective as someone that works in Salem, we look at the federal state the split a little bit differently. Although we have elections in the state for our congressmen, U.S. senators, we typically consider that's a federal election. And so, yes, super PACs may be active in Oregon, but not within the Oregon election system, which is for electing local and state officials as opposed to federal officials. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so they can act on behalf of the U.S. senators or a U.S. House of Representative like Earl Blumenauer and the presidential candidates. But when it comes to the governor or your city council or anything, in between there, super PACs are not involved in
Super PACs, no, but what we do have is what's called independent expenditures, and
that. Okay.
so and which are a lot more transparent and easier to track. And so think about it this way. River, if
Mhm.
you were running for an office, you would have to report all of your expenses and donations from any source.
Okay.
Now, if I say I'm going to write you a $200 check, then that shows up on Orstar. And if I say, River, I'm going to help you out by giving you $200 worth of clipboards, um, that's not cash, but you're still going to have to report that because it's what we call an in-kind donation. And so that'll show up as if someone goes to Orstar and looks, they're going to say, okay, it looks like Mike donated $200, but it was an in-kind contribution of clipboards, or you
Mhm.
might say supplies or whatever, but you actually have
Right.
to kind of say what it was. There's also something called an independent expenditure, which is where I don't coordinate with you. And I say, you know what, I really like River's campaign. I think what I'll do is take out an ad on her behalf in the Oregonian, and I'm not going to let her know about it. I'm just going to take out an ad and say, I I might support River for emperor, and this is why you should vote for her. And and that's what would be called an independent expenditure, because it was independent to your campaign. You didn't know about it. You didn't coordinate with it. And thusly, there are some organizations in the state that are independent expenditure efforts, and they have to maintain their own reporting, but they also report their donations. So if Shuey McSneakerface wanted to start an independent expenditure effort, it would still show up on Orstar, and then you could go into it and look and say, let's see, where are they getting their money? Oh, they're getting it from Mr. Sneakerface, I see. So you know, that's how we kind of like to keep things transparent. I like to say when it comes to campaign finance, some states go all in on limits, and some states like Oregon go all in on transparency. Um, it's you got to have one or the other, or it's a mess. Well,
Right.
some
Right.
people would argue it's a mess anyway.
Moving to this year, I know you had some bills that were up for review in the short legislative session. One that I remember in particular that you had talked to me about was regarding hair. Uh, can you go a bit into that one?
Yes. This is Representative Janelle Bynum's bill. She's a Democrat out of Happy Valley, and she introduced a bill dealing with discrimination, and it was dealing with the kind of latent discrimination that is not overt, but happens nonetheless in ways that uh, disproportionately affect particular groups of people.
Mhm.
And so it had two parts to it. And one of the parts was hairstyle discrimination, where we see examples of schools and other public accommodations telling students, oh, guess what? You're not allowed to have an afro if you're going to be wrestling. So you're going to need to shave that off. Or you're not allowed to have, your hair in cornrows, so you can't participate in the graduation ceremony. Now, ordinarily, well, I think they would say, well, we're not discriminating against race, we're just discriminating against hairstyles. But let's be frank,
Mhm.
there's not a lot of white students that are running into those problems. And so it's essentially racial discrimination by another name. And the bill very, very adeptly worked within the existing definitions of discrimination and public accommodation to clarify that if this is a personal attribute that disproportionately is ending up affecting one race over another, then you still run into the same discrimination laws that you would ordinarily. The other part of the bill
Mhm.
similarly addressed what we've seen happen more on the East Coast, but we want to address before it comes over to Oregon, is cash discrimination, where we're seeing more and more retail operations operating on a cashless basis, saying we will not serve you if you don't have a credit card or a debit card. We will only serve people with plastic. We will not honor cash, which sounds very fancy and futuristic. But the fact of the matter is that there are tens of millions of households in the United States that are unbanked and don't have a way of getting plastic cards. To boot, there are 3 times as many households that are underbanked, which means that they do have a bank account but may not have credit or debit cards. And a lot of people say that, well, gosh, there's so many options available that you can just walk into Walmart and get some cards. So ahead of the hearing, I did walk into a store and I got these cash cards that you buy them and you put a certain amount of money on them. And the fees are so intense on these cards that I put $20 on each card, and I had five. No, I put 25 because I had 4 cards. Here's the 4th one. So I walked out of the store with having put $25 on each card. So my wallet was $100 lighter. As I exited the store, these cards were worth $81 combined. So just exiting the store was a 19% bump. By the end of the month, they're going to be worth 54 cents on the dollar. So what it does, what the cashless discrimination ends up doing is taking people who are already in a marginally financially marginal situation and making it actively worse for them. Because when we talk about food deserts and when we talk about opportunities for public accommodations, it's insidious to have neighborhoods where there are no accommodations or opportunities for people. It's doubly insidious to say there are opportunities here, but they're not for you. And so considering that affects households of color up to 6 times more than it affects white households. This was also added into that bill. And I have the pleasure of representing the United Food and Commercial Workers Local on that bill in cooperation with Representative Bynum.
And what happened with that bill?
That bill was actually making its way pretty handily through the process. As you may imagine, it initially ran into some concern from business interests, et cetera, but it started out with a lot of bipartisan support. And this is one of those issues where I talked about earlier, where you end up forming coalitions and alliances with people that you wouldn't have would have guessed years or months ago. We had some very conservative members who were saying, I'm in favor of this because no way is the government going to tell me I can't spend my gold at the store. But at the end of the day, we actually were able to get everyone together and put out a consensus version of the bill, which means that we brought all of the opposition voices in, and we stayed late. And it's kind of neat how it happens. It's actually, don't tell anyone, but it's my favorite part when everyone kind of they break off to their little huddles and they say, okay, what can we live with? And then you go and send emissaries to other groups and say, like, are you guys good with A if we give you B? And we wound up with a really good bill that people could live with. And it was slated for passage, and then because of the politics around the Republican walkout, the Republicans in both the House and the Senate opted to deny what's called a quorum to each chamber to do business, which meant that because of their opposition to some other policy, there was a and the process, to be honest, they were concerned about the process as well. The nuclear option, so to speak, is to shut down the process by saying you don't have 40 members in the House or 20 members in the Senate, thusly you can't do any business. So
So it completely got shut down and never came for a vote?
That's correct, because Oregon has, as of 2010, has added time limits to its session. So I think that our deadline was to act by midnight on March 8th, or else everything would evaporate. And so that was in the process, queued up with a whole bunch of other bills. And midnight comes around on March 8th, and they're gone. They can be reintroduced either in a special session or in a subsequent session, but they'll have a new bill number and we'll need to start from scratch. But the good news is that when we do start, we've already got a consensus amendment. Our bill wasn't the controversial one at the end of the day. So luckily, when we do start, we're just going to start with the consensus version and say, all right, everyone, this is what we agreed to in February of 2020. Let's make it happen.
Love to hear that.
Yeah.
Going into March, how did the big event of the year impact what was happening at the legislature?
When you say the big event, it's 2020, so you're going to have to be much more specific.
The coronavirus. I know that the legislature was essentially sent home before everybody, before the usual time anyway, and social distancing measures were put in place, and all of that. How did that all come about?
Well, like I said, the session was time limited to end March 8th. And so even though we had kind of heard about this crazy virus that was happening in China at the time, we didn't have the full scale reaction during session. That all happened after session was over. And so like I said, the legislators have other jobs and other lives, so they were back home in district by that time, just going through what they usually go through. There were still legislative support staff working in Salem because they work year round. There's some legislative staff maintain offices in their Salem offices year round. But it's really kind of a skeleton crew, so to speak. And so the real impact of the pandemic response is that it affected the potential for having a special session to readdress what didn't get done in 2020. So the excuse me. So initially, some of the legislative leadership had indicated that, well, since we didn't get to finish our business during the regular session, we're going to call the legislature into a special session, which is relatively rare, but it's not the most rare thing. And the advantage is that there's no time limit for a special session. So if someone were to say, well, fine, we're going to deny quorum and not let anything move forward, then you could just say, fine, we'll be here when you get back, let us know. But because obviously they didn't want a bunch of people together in a building with a terrible AC system, and I think the average age for legislators is higher than it would be in a high school, I suppose. I'll just leave it at that. The idea is to make sure that as much is worked out for a special session in advance, and that we're only dealing with the necessary COVID response items. There's not really going to be a lot of time to sit around, bickering and debating esoteric issues, or even some of the very necessary issues that we would like to. Even though we have a consensus, for example, on this discrimination bill, we're not going to have time for people to sit in the same building together in proximity and hash that out. It takes time to put it through a process, even if it's all wired beforehand. And so there have been a series of of meetings for a pandemic response committee that has been put together to kind of tie all these issues together. If one were to go onto the Oregon Legislative Information System website that I mentioned earlier,
Mhm.
you could go to the committees section, see the joint, I think it's called the Joint Coronavirus Response Committee, but I may be
Mhm.
getting that wrong. You could see, the membership, you could see all their meeting materials, but most
Mhm.
importantly, you can tune into their meetings. You can see their meeting schedule, and then you can actually watch it in real time. You
Nice.
can, yeah, exactly, and you can, ask to be on the witness list, and you can submit testimony. You can participate just like you would be able to participate in person, or maybe not just like, but as good as right now is safe. Now, when they have the special session,
Mhm.
that committee will turn into an actual legislative committee instead of a what's called an interim committee. Before, when there's no session on, they still hold committee meetings. They still do work, and so the work that they're preparing in this interim committee will then just kind of get shifted over to a session committee, turned into a bill or more than one bill, and and move through the process as normal, but hopefully without a lot of uh, uh, speed bumps.
Okay. Do you think this will have long-term impacts in such things as being able, regular voters being able to watch meetings and be able to, participate remotely?
I'm going to give you another yes and no answer to that because I'm such a good lobbyist. I love giving yes and no answers. Um, uh, yes, because I think that the need for that has become very, very underscored in terms of um, how do we uh, how do we go through this process while at the same time maintaining Oregon's hallmark of public participation and transparency? Um, no, because to be very honest, the legislature is already on that track. We've made some very significant leaps and bounds over the last few years in terms of connecting people to the legislative process through video, through remote testimony, like I
Yeah.
said, through submitting written testimony online. And and so I think that this is certainly going to put that in sharper perspective and maybe increase the priority of that. But it's work that's already being done, which is actually putting us ahead of the curve on a lot of this.
Nice. That is really, really good to hear. Um, I have heard there's a possibility that some schools may not actually be opening until next year at this point. Now we know at least in I know in the I heard from the Hillsborough, Beaverton Hillsborough area that I think it was the Beaverton School District had already decided, hey everybody, uh, the rest of the school year is now online. We're not going to get back this school year. Um, do you know or have heard anything about maybe how that would, if that's something that you've heard out in the kind of legislative sphere for other areas in Oregon, or do you think that it's a possibility we could be seeing this continue into the next school year, or even the next, just regular calendar year? Um, and since you've done some lobbying work on how things impact working families, how that sort of thing with not having school uh, for kids to go to, even just for the rest of this school year, how maybe next school year or next year that might look in your experience.
Well, the short answer on this one is I really don't know.
Yeah.
I know that the whatever the British equivalent of the health authority is recommending that their lockdown or self-isolation is going to probably last till the end of the year or longer.
Right.
Hopefully, we're doing a little better here, um, but I think that this idea that well, obviously, if anyone thought it was going to be over by Easter, they were mistaken.
Right.
Um, the uh, what I can tell you that I've been more closely working on is making sure that childcare options are somehow accessible, and we're talking through a lot of ways to make sure that that happens.
Hmm.
And we are uh, looking at prioritizing the parents that do have to be out and about, first responders, frontline workers, that sort of thing. And
Grocery
then,
store workers, restaurateurs as well.
yep, well, we want to include those in frontline workers,
Okay.
for sure. Um, the and that in itself is another conversation. Um, but we will be pushing that, and I know that that's actually become a campaign topic for legislators that are running now, which is it's interesting to see how this is actively affecting what campaigns are talking about in real time. Um, the To the degree that the K-12 system is going to be operating, I have no idea. But what I do know is that the the teachers in all of this have just been absolutely amazing at um, not only keeping in contact with their students, but
Hmm.
also in basically building a entire education infrastructure within a very short amount of time.
Yeah.
Um, and our public school teachers in Oregon are absolutely amazing and continually underappreciated. And
Mhm.
uh, that's a story that I think we need to remember for a long time when this is over.
How do you think Oregon is doing in ensuring that students have access to technology and internet so that they can go to school in this non-school environment?
Mhm. Um, I think that we will be doing better, but I think that this whole episode has, in a very, very big way, underscored that there is the digital divide right now. And the concern that I'm hearing from a lot of people, including teachers, is that they don't want to be giving kids grades based on how good their internet connection is.
Right.
Um, and so I think that uh, we will be hearing a lot more about that in the future. I talked to someone last week regarding if we're actually going to be, saying that this is the new normal. It's time to start talking about broadband internet as a public utility.
Yeah.
It's not just a way to get Netflix if you can afford to pay a few more a month. If we're going to say this is potentially how school works now. We
Hmm.
have to acknowledge that um, everybody in the state needs uh, uh, quality,
Affordable,
accessible,
high-speed internet.
affordable, high-speed internet, whether that's coming from a supplier like Comcast, or since there's plenty of areas that private industry doesn't want to serve, we need to allow the public to serve and subsidize those services as well.
Right. I That sounds like amazing work. Definitely let us know if there are any sites that you're aware of to help people donate laptops or funds to get students connected, and I will put that in the description on the video and along with the OLS system and the organ or star system that you had mentioned. Um, how is so? A couple of phrases that I've heard in regards to campaigning are, going out and kissing babies, or pressing the flesh, as in shaking hands and getting into a hug picture to
Yep.
do with things. Um, what is campaigning like when the last thing you're allowed to do is anything involving kissing, hugging, touching at all? You don't want to be walking around door to door to everybody, in the grassroots manner of like Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. How does that work? Because local elections in particular are often very dependent
Yep.
on the hitting the pavement, going to houses, knocking on doors, because our social media systems are not set up to give us correct information about who our legislators are and who our candidates are. Because I'm getting, things about, Clackamas County uh, elections, and I'm like, I know the general area where that is. I've lived here long enough that I can vaguely point it out on a map, but I'm pretty sure they don't represent me over here in the more western side of things. How is that working? How are candidates responding? And do you think that there's going to end up being a struggle with new candidates challenging incumbents when getting your face out there, you don't have the town halls, you don't have the door-to-doors in the same way?
Yep.
Yeah, just on that.
So first of all, if you are a chaotic good alignment, you are loving this campaign season. The fact is that every campaign's campaign plan that they put together last year is absolutely blown apart. I have been a major proponent of field work because I have dug into the research, and it's the best way to lock in your message and increase your turnout is when you actually have someone at the door or pressing flesh. And for the record, the last time I saw a candidate kiss a baby was in 2005. But the fact is that, as you mentioned, we're not able to do that. There's some campaigns that are still doing literature drops where they take what they would have handed you at the door, and they're just leaving it there now, wearing gloves. And I've been advising all the campaigns that I've been helping out with. I've been saying, if you are going to be sending someone, have protocols in place. Don't just advise someone to be careful. Have a very clear set of rules, like you change your gloves every time this happens, or you're wiping down every time you touch something other than the stack of literature, etc. And but a lot of campaigns aren't sending people out because there's a lot less volunteers willing to walk around. And so you see a lot of campaigns shifting to phones. You can still, that's still the best way to have a one-to-one conversation with a voter. And that's typically a volunteer making the call, but I see a lot of candidates making calls too, and I think that's great. At the same time, I think that a lot of campaigns are going to have to be focused more on what are we going to shift those resources into, because some people will do canvassing, but they will absolutely not do phones in terms of volunteering. And so I think there's a lot of campaigns that are investing more in social media. There's a lot of campaigns that are going to be investing more in print ads. There's also always a lot of campaigns, as anyone with a front door knows, investing in campaign mail. And I know that everyone hates campaign mail, but I'm just going to say the best thing that people can do to help democracy and help make sure that they're making an educated decision, read the campaign mail and don't just throw it out. And I know that it's biased, and you're getting a message right from the campaign, but read it to figure out, all right, what's the campaign telling me, and then do your research. We're all cooped up at home. I mean, not all of us, but a lot of us are cooped up at home. Take that time to say, this person's claiming that that they have a secret cure for the coronavirus. Let me see if that's true. It's probably not. But you know what? You're going to be more educated on the candidates if you read that stuff. And especially when you get your voters pamphlet statement, read that. The voters pamphlet statement is the single most powerful tool that a voter has in their arsenal in terms of being informed. Read about the issues, not necessarily the stances of the, I should say, not necessarily only the stances of the candidates, but also what issues they're choosing to focus on, who their
Mhm.
endorsements are from, who's saying good things about them, who's saying good things about their opponent, and what organizations are supporting them. It
Mhm.
makes a difference to kind of try to break out of your preconceived notions and uh, and challenge yourself with information. And the primary is a great time to do that because you get to do that free of a lot of the partisan divide.
Mhm.
Um, in terms of how to challengers get a leg up, I think that in the Portland city races, it's going to be very, very interesting because a lot of the candidates have taken advantage of Portland's open and accountable elections program, which
Mhm.
is equalizing a lot of the campaign finance. It's capping donations and providing a public match so that it's a much more level playing field. So you're going to have situations where you might have had a challenger who uh, intended to do a lot of canvassing to get their name out. Suddenly uh, that volunteer base may be worthless to them, and they're stuck with the same budget for their mail plan that their opponent has.
Mhm.
Whether that's going to work in favor or against a candidate depends on what their field plan was in December, I think,
Mhm.
um, or their general campaign plan. I can tell you that I've run campaigns that were outspent 3-1, and we managed to get over the hump and be victorious. It's it's really a matter of making sure that you're using your resources smartly, and I don't think that that's
Mhm.
really changed much uh, from the
Before
new.
times.
Yeah.
Um, so how do voters um, get information on candidates? Because I have found when I have looked up and I'm that nerd. I'll admit it. I am the nerd that goes and looks up every person listed on a ballot, even when I have a gajillion things to do to try and find information. Are there easy, straightforward ways that people who, yes, they may have more time on their hands, but honestly, some of them don't, because now it's they are working and raising their children
Yeah.
at the same time. And so while it seems like extra time, in practicality, doing two things at once is often failing at both. It seems like, and a lot of these parents are doing their best to make it work. But adding like, okay, I need to spend several hours digging into the candidates for the water commission of whatever, um, when that information has not necessarily, you haven't seen candidates submit that in the voter information packets, which has been a problem, and you see that they're not listed and given a profile in major outlets every time, like
Sure.
in those smaller, not even down ballot, but like literally bottom ballot, like the last, when you
Sure.
remember to flip over the ballot, there's those other people still there, sort of issues. How can voters who have never tried to research, or are new to research, how can we find this information out there when we can't count on being able to get out our candidates coming to us?
A voter pamphlet statement will be mailed to you.
Hmm.
That is, like I said, the best tool that a voter is going to have. And if you do nothing else, flip through the voter pamphlet statement and look at candidates. And
Hmm.
I'll tell you, and regarding those, the more obscure races that may not have candidates in the voter pamphlet,
Hmm.
I'll tell you a secret about me that's just about to become a not secret, I guess. Um, if a candidate does not make that modicum of effort in terms of getting my vote by at least introducing themselves in the pamphlet,
Hmm.
probably not going to vote for them. I'm probably not going to vote in that race if there's no one that's actually put themselves in there. Sometimes there's people that are running unopposed and they didn't take the time to introduce themselves in the pamphlet, and I'm not going to vote for someone that I have no idea who it is. I could certainly do the research, but like you said, I understand that takes time to a lot of people.
Mhm.
Takes time for everyone. Um, so there's no shame in doing your research and deciding. I don't think any of the candidates really convinced me that this race is important. I
Mhm.
think that uh, it's the candidate's responsibility to convey their message to you. That's what the campaign is about. And the voter pamphlet um, is something that a candidate can pay to be in, but it's also something that they can collect signatures to be in for free.
Mhm.
So it's not a matter of a financial divide. It's just a matter of, does a candidate feel that they value your vote enough to present information to you? And
Right.
like I said, um, there's oftentimes going to be a verification process, but
Mhm.
if you see that someone's listed in the voter pamphlet as supporting that candidate,
Mhm.
then that person's legitimately supported that candidate, because a county will not print an endorser in the voter pamphlet without paperwork from that endorser. So, for
Okay.
instance, if you see some obscure candidate in the voter pamphlet and it says endorsed by Barack Obama,
Mhm.
you can take it to the bank that, okay, that's real. I
Mhm.
don't know how they landed that endorsement, but they must have got the paperwork, and the county looked at the paperwork and said, yeah, that's signed, and if it's not, it's a felony. But
All that. Yeah.
and so occasionally you'll see bizarre claims from fringe candidates in the voter pamphlet, and those are usually pretty easy to pick out.
Mhm.
But when you're reading through, you know, your usual candidate statements, you're going to know three things. You're going to know who's supporting them. You're going to know where they are in the issues that they want to describe to you. And
Mhm.
also importantly, you're going to know uh, what issues they decided to focus on.
Mhm.
Um, a candidate that wants to focus on equity and climate change is going to have a different set of values than a candidate that wants to focus on jobs and deregulation.
Mhm.
Not that those are, and I've seen candidates from both sides of the aisle pick up on both of those issues, but
Mhm.
um, the frame of the debate matters too,
Mhm.
because that often tells a voter not only what the positions of the candidate are, but what's that candidate's priorities going to be when they get to office. Because most legislation doesn't fail for a lack of votes. Most legislation fails for a lack of interest.
Mhm. That that makes sense. Well, there is one more topic that I really want to just dive into really quick. It's a completely non-controversial, and
I don't believe
in
it.
no in no way polarizing issue. Um, we are met most Americans, uh, with like bizarre exceptions. I've heard sex workers, legal sex workers in this category apparently, are set to get a stimulus check from the US government, um, for, I think it's 1,400 per person, and then 500 per kid, because I guess they're not quite full people somehow. And here in the next, as long as you don't make more than 100,000, and if you're between 70 and 99, you get a decreasing amount um, in there. So we're set to get these checks from the government to do with whatever we want. There is no restrictions. There's no you got to be applying for jobs, or you have to show disability. This is almost, some might say, a basic, sort of universal income for 1 month.
For 1 month.
um, what is your perspective on the universal basic income as a congratulations, you are a legal citizen of the United States, or a registered alien, or however they want to define that particular point of it. And you get, $1,000 a month to do with whatever for existing as an American. You get this money every month to do with what you will. What are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on it as a political thing, both federally, but also, states are starting to take initiatives on things like this, as an idea for here in Oregon, or even more locally in some of, like, Portland City Council. And is this something that you support? So, just a five-word answer for that in no way complex topic.
Five-word answer for that. Oh, that's
Right.
a five-word. I don't think that I'm in a position to give a thumbs up or thumbs down completely like that. I will say that one of my concerns about a universal basic income is how do we make sure that that's actually betting people and families equitably. If there's not a way to get that into the hands of undocumented families, then we end up taking an existing divide, just making that enormously wider. And if
Mm-hmm.
the purpose is, in fact, as people say, to stimulate the economy, then we should absolutely make sure that as many people are participating as possible. So I don't think that there's a reason not to. Assuming that all the details could be worked out, I think that that's an idea that merits consideration very seriously, because the prosperity of our economy is based on how fast and how broadly a particular dollar can get respent and cycle through the economy. If it and how many times, if I spend $1 and it heads up to some CEO as fast as it possibly can and just sits there in a savings account, or gets spent on a yacht that goes to some yacht maker in Germany,
Mm-hmm.
that's not very good. But if it keeps on getting spent between employee to employee to employee, that's a much broader benefit. And I think that the dollars that are getting spent, they don't care whether the person holding them is a sex worker or has documents or whatever. That dollar contributes to the economy if we let it, and it will increase division in the economy if we let it. So,
Mm-hmm.
not opposed to it. Certainly think that it should be considered. We need to think very carefully about making sure that it's doing the right things, and not contributing to inequality. Having said that, I think $1,200 for 1 month is just about internationally one of the worst responses. It's tone deaf. It's the right, I think, thinking, but it's almost like if I were to go to the store to kind of stock up for the week for the pandemic and come back with like a box of raisins, I mean, my wife would say, well, I like that you got food, but that's certainly not enough.
Right. Yeah, I was wondering on that amount as well, because rent, for example, uh, $1,200, that's just rent, for two bedrooms, and depending on where you are, that's not even rent. And sometimes not even for two bedrooms, depending on where you landed during this. So you're supposed to shelter in a place where you don't have enough money to cover the rent.
Yep.
Um,
Well,
do
I'm
you
glad.
feel? Continue. Sorry.
I'm glad to see that we are moving towards an eviction moratorium. in Multnomah County. We also need to be considering mortgage and rent moratoriums, as well as as well as other kinds of debt that are going to have long-term adverse impacts to people, such as student loans and credit card debt.
Mhm.
The fact of the matter is that the people who are getting the bulk of the COVID-related assistance and bailouts are the people that need them the absolute least.
Right. Right. And yeah, that's true. I'm glad to hear that we're looking at a rent moratorium in Multnomah. Do you think that's going to be expanded to? Is that something that we're looking at statewide in terms of that? And is more explain to me, is moratorium where they're like, you don't have to pay rent this month, but once this is lifted and all of that, then you're gonna owe for however many months, you know, come due.
That's going to have to be one of the questions that gets worked out. Whether
Mhm.
it's we're hitting pause, or whether it's that's going to build up, but we're just going to push all of the due dates out. Um, and so far what we have in the metro region is an eviction moratorium. That only means that people can't get kicked out. It's not actually changing due date, as I understand it.
Right,
It's not actually changing due dates for rent, but people should not take my word for it, but actually go look that up, because I'm not intimately into these conversations, and so I don't want to give anyone bad information.
right, right. Um, and is there any concerns that you have for you or your family during the rest of this? You know, how are you guys doing in terms of, you know, health and concerns? You mentioned vulnerability. I don't know if you want to go into that, but if you do, I think people would be interested.
Sure. On a personal note, we're very lucky. Like I said, we both have jobs we can do from home. We're um, go out for. Um, I like to say, like, I go out into the plague lands, like I'm questing for food about once a week.
Hmm.
Get my mask. Um, but the wife is currently pregnant, and so uh, not the best immune system at the moment. Um, and it's kind of an up in the air question as to what hospital services are going to look like come the due date. And so it's a little it's a little odd going through this very singular experience
Hmm.
without the foreknowledge of, is society going to exist by then? Uh, and that's hyperbole, of course. I am very confident that society will exist. What we don't know is, am I going to be allowed in the delivery room? Is there going to be adequate staffing? Is she going to be able to stay at the hospital longer than an hour if need be, et cetera, et cetera? It just takes a lot of, it just takes a situation with already a lot of unknowns and adds a lot more unknowns to it.
Yeah.
But like I said,
Yeah.
dealing with a lot of luck right now in terms of our current situation. So uh, we understand that despite that unknowingness, we are in fact very truly blessed.
Well, you guys are wonderful, and I am very much looking forward to holding the adorable baby once it is safe to do so.
Me too.
um, it's wonderful to talk with you, Mike. Thank you so much for taking so much time out of your day
Of course.
to speak with me, and you know, I'm sure that we will talk again soon on here and elsewhere. Um, Stay safe, stay well. Good luck with the pregnancy, and bye for now.
Thank you very much. For Have a good rest of your day, and
Will do.
you know, in solidarity.
Thanks. All right. Bye.
Bye.
No.